Okay, now that you're comfortable with how fast you're going and being able to control the speed of your sewing and also with the whole starting and stopping process, it's time to learn how to control the direction that you're doing your sewing. And we are still going to be sewing on paper. We have these 3 sheets that you can print out in the lesson materials, and we're going to start with just straight lines. So we're going to start with this sheet here to begin with. In all of this, you're going to want to remember to gently guide with your fingers back here. The first step we're going to do is just to sew on these lines. So remember, we're going to put our foot down. See if you can line up your needle so that it's going to be on the line, and then just practice sewing on the line. Now remember, the machine is going to make it go pretty straight on its own, so don't be touching the paper or anything or guiding until you think you actually need to. One point I will make is to try to look out here. You'll see on your foot there is probably a line right here. Be looking ahead where you're going and not at where your needle is going down. That will help you make a nice straight line. So I'm looking way out here as I'm guiding, not so much at the needle. So just practice with those 4 lines, and again practice also stopping at the end of the line, right at the end of the line, and doing the whole lifting the presser foot, making sure the needle is up, and then going back up to the next one, putting your presser foot down, and then sewing each line, and then we'll move on to the next step. The next thing I want you to practice is sewing next to the line, just lining up the presser foot edge next to this line and seeing if you can do that as well. Try again looking ahead and just sewing next to the line. See if you can do that as well. Remember to try to look ahead and not at the needle as you're doing that. So try to do that as well on the lines. And you'll want to be sewing with it on this side of the presser foot. This will make sense later, but line it up on this side of the presser foot because we're going to be working on seam allowances next. But practice that on each of the lines. And again, keep on practicing your stopping and starting routine so that when you get to the end, you're not thinking about it, you're just naturally doing each step. So first you practiced sewing on the line just so you could get confident in being able to steer as you're sewing along, and then I had you practice sewing next to a line. And that's because most of the time you are not going to be sewing on a line that you've marked on a project. You're going to be sewing a certain distance from the edge of a piece of fabric. And that distance here is called the seam allowance. It's called the seam allowance because it's the amount that is allowed for the seam. So a pattern like this doll pattern here for the front of a dress has you cut pieces of fabric out in certain shapes, right? And then inside it's assuming that your stitching line is going to be on these inside lines right here. It looks like stitching lines right there. Every pattern assumes a certain amount of seam allowance. They will say something like, in this case, use 1/4 inch seams or a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's important to use the seam allowance or the amount here that they're expecting between the edge of the fabric that you cut out and the seam that you're sewing, because you want the finished piece to turn out the right size. If you sewed something much bigger than this, then this resulting part in the middle wouldn't be the same size that you're expecting it to be. So for example, if you were making a skirt and you expected it to be a certain width, and they told you to sew the seams only this wide and you sewed them instead this wide, then the amount in the middle would be a lot smaller than you were expecting and the skirt wouldn't fit. So that's why there are such things as seam allowances. And when someone says to use a 1/4 inch seam, they mean to use a seam allowance that is a 1/4 inch wide from the edge of the fabric to where the seam is. Most patterns for clothing call for 5/8 inch wide seam allowances. That's because you need a little extra in case you need to do some alterations. You can move the seam to make something a little bigger if you need to. But things like quilting and doll clothes usually just use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you are sewing, you're going to want to sew so that most of your fabric and everything is over here on the left, because there isn't so much room over here inside the machine. You want to have it set up so that the edge that you're sewing on is over here on the right hand side and all your extra fabric is over here. So as I'm demonstrating, keep that in mind. You're always going to be sewing your seam so that the edge that you're sewing against is over here on the right. So to be able to measure what your seam allowance is going to be, you want to be able to measure the distance from where the needle is, because that's where the seam is going to be, to the edge of the fabric. Most sewing machines have little marks on them here, and they usually will have little indications of how far away each of those marks is from the needle. So if you want to line it up to say this was a 1/2 inch here, you would line your edge of fabric up here with the mark, and then you would just keep that edge of your fabric there as you sewed along. And that is what you would be following, which is why we were practicing before over here by sewing, not following a line here, but following a line over here. There are things you can buy to help guide your fabric here. Things like this magnetic seam guide right here. You would just snug it up against this line here that you want to sew against, and then you could just butt your fabric up against there as you're sewing along, and this guide would help keep your fabric right there so that you would have a consistent seam allowance. I've also seen some feet that have little guides that come off to this side so that you can align it up to there. They don't often come with sewing machines, but if you have one, you can check in your manual, see if you have one. That also works. But by far, I think the easiest and cheapest thing to do, and I think it actually works the best, is to use washi tape to mark your machine. I'm going to show you how to do this, and then I'm going to talk about why this is, I think, the best way for a beginner to learn how to sew a consistent seam allowance. So what we want to do is put a piece of tape, just like these lines, but going to extend it further out here. So we're going to want to measure the distance from the needle out for the seam allowance. So let's say I want to use a 5/8 seam allowance. You could use a ruler like this, and I'm going to put the needle right there at 5/8. I'm also going to make sure that this is lined up with the machine, that it's not like this or like this, but it's nice and straight with the machine here. And you can see that line doesn't quite line up with any of my lines. So this is good if you have to do a seam allowance that you don't have marked on your machine already. And then I can take a piece of washi tape here and just put it along the ruler just like this. Now, if you don't have a quilting ruler, don't worry. You can also just use a piece of paper. You would draw your line on here where you want your seam allowance to be. This is a 5/8, and you could just line it up with your needle there, and again, just put the tape on like this. The reason washi tape like this works so well for beginners is it keeps you from watching the needle. If you think about it, once it's up here, it's already sewing. It's too late to make any adjustments. Washi tape marked like this allows you to look way back here and make nice even adjustments as you go along. If you just look back here, it's much easier to make smooth adjustments instead of jerky adjustments that you might be saying, oh my goodness, it's not right, and making a jerky adjustment. You have lots of time if you're adjusting back here. So I would definitely recommend marking your machine with some washi tape. It will really help you have nice straight seams. So go ahead and use washi tape to mark your seam allowance right here. Use whatever seam allowance you think you might be using most. If you're a quilter, it will be 1/4 inch. If you're a garment sewer, it will be something more like 5/8 of an inch or a centimeter if you're using metric. And then practice running the edge of your paper along there and see if you can get nice straight seams by looking way back here. And see how much easier it is to look way out here and run the edge of it along the washi tape as opposed to trying to keep this straight when you were just lining up the foot against this line. And after you've practiced this, we'll move on to how to turn corners. To learn how to turn corners, we're going to use this piece of paper. And again, you could do this, you're going to be able to do this on the edge like this, but this is a really great way. We're going to just follow this line and we're going to turn all these corners, and by the time you're done, you will have good practice at turning corners. So start right at the beginning there, in the middle, and go right down to the first corner. And stop with your needle in the fabric. So I have a needle down mechanism, but you could also use your hand wheel to put the needle down right on the corner. And then take your foot off the pedal because you want to make sure that needle stays down as you do the next thing. You're going to lift your presser foot, turn it so it faces the next direction, put your presser foot down again, and then sew to the next corner. And again, you can do the hand wheel if you have to make it go to the next corner. Leave that needle down, lift the presser foot up, turn, put the presser foot down, and go down to the next corner. So at each corner, you're going to put the needle down and then lift up the presser foot, turn the fabric, put the needle back down again, and go. And you can go and practice all the way around, and then you'll be a pro at corners. Then we're going to move on to curves. Okay, sewing curves. I really hesitated even putting this in here, so if you want to skip this right now, go right ahead, skip curves, okay? Because there really aren't that many curves in beginner projects. But at some point, you're going to want to sew a curve, so I want to give you a few tips for that point when you get to it. Just like with the straight line, at some point you're going to be not sewing on lines, you're going to be sewing against edges so that you are maintaining consistent seam allowances. But first, practice just sewing on the lines. I would start with this nice shallow curve and see how that goes, and then move on to the tighter curves. One thing to remember as you're sewing curves is always, just like before, to use a gentle touch, no pulling and tugging to make things go places. Just a very gentle touch will do it. And if you feel like you're ever getting off course, remember you can put your needle down and just move it just a little bit and get back on course again. That works for exceptionally tight curves if you have any like that. After you've practiced sewing the curves, get your paper scissors out. Remember, don't use your fabric scissors on paper because the paper will dull them faster. So get your paper scissors out and cut on these lines so that we'll have some nice curved edges to practice on. Okay, now we have lots of curves that we can practice on. What makes sewing curves tricky is that you actually do have to watch right here at the needle. You can't be using this washi tape way out here because we're talking about just the seam allowance at the needle. Because we're going around curves, looking ahead doesn't work. You need to actually be looking right here at the needle. So I'm going to take this off so it doesn't actually confuse us. And I am going to mark one thing, which is I'm going to put the washi tape so I can see right where the needle is. Once you've been sewing long enough to be doing curves, you probably won't need this sort of washi tape, but this will help you understand what I'm talking about as we're doing this sewing of the curves. So I've marked both the line that I'm going to be using for the seam allowance line here, and right where the needle is. And that's the point. That cross here is where I want the edge of my paper or my fabric to be so that I get a consistent seam allowance. So just like we did before, I'm just going to sew slowly and guide gently along the curve. And I have to keep my eye right there. Which isn't helping me because I'm going to run off the paper here. So we'll do it a little less than that. Now see, I feel like I'm getting a little off course here. I can still do the same thing. I can put my needle down, move the paper a little bit, and get more on course again. Sometimes when you're doing inner corners, like right here, the fabric might get bunched up a little bit, and again, if you drop your needle, then you can just straighten things out. But again, it takes focusing on that point here, which is a more advanced skill because it's a little harder to guide everything when you're looking so close and at one point instead of way down here like you are when you're learning to sew a straight seam. But you can do it with practice, but I don't want you to worry about it right now. If you have curved seams, you can come back to this lesson and then do some practicing of your own. Once you feel comfortable with sewing straight along the edge of the fabric, a consistent seam allowance, and you understand how all that works, and you've got the starting and stopping and speed all done, we can move on to the next lesson, which is all about threading your machine and getting it ready to actually sew a seam on fabric.